we've seen the problems of changing CEOs every year in Eskom. That is what we don't need right now. We need stability. We need people with vision. We need determination. We need to roll up our sleeves and do what has to be done, and not get sidetracked by populist demands, for a scapegoat. That's not the solution in any way.
Hello, my name is Donald, and welcome to the #1 media company, WorldView. At WorldView, we explore everyone's perspectives on all things that can broaden our worldview. Today, we're talking with Chris Yelland. Chris is an energy analyst, consultant, electrical engineer, public speaker, writer, and managing director at EE Business Intelligence. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thank you indeed for having me, and hello to your listeners.
So, Chris, there are many rumors of the incompetence at Eskom, how things are just badly mismanaged. Can you give our viewers some data or stories of how things are just not managed correctly at Eskom?
Well, I think the situation has been very well aired in the media, and indeed by the CEO, the COO in media briefings of late. And it really is alarming to have seen an organization of the size and critical importance of Eskom falling into a state of severe mismanagement. In fact, you could say that at a certain point in Eskom's history over the last 10 years, management controls actually broke down, stemming right from the top, from the board itself, through to the CEO at the time, CEOs at the time. And there have been many over the last decades, something like 10 CEOs over the last decade. And there was a complete breakdown of governance, and it's most acutely seen in the Eskom procurement processes, where at the very highest level of Eskom, within the board itself, and the CEOs and the executives, things were just totally out of control. It's part of the state capture narrative. It's real. It has been aired in Parliament, at the Zondo Commission, and it has been really alarming. I am pleased to say, though, that there is a new CEO who has put in place a new executive team. There's a new board. There's still a huge amount of work to be done, because there are literally layers and layers of senior management, middle management, and just operational people who have the wrong attitude and the wrong approach. It extends, at the head office, at Megawatt Park, through to some, not all, power stations, and in many of the regional operations as well. Now, I just want to stress that I'm not suggesting that everybody at Eskom is incompetent or corrupt or anything like that. There are many, many good people who are and have been working hard in difficult circumstances for years, and who are deeply troubled by what has happened to a once proud organization. So, yeah, it is endemic, it is deep-rooted, it is being rooted out, but you've got to understand that Eskom actually is not a prosecuting authority, nor is it an investigative authority, nor is it the police or the Justice Department, and it really relies on these other state organs to perform their role and function effectively. Eskom right now is in the midst of a financial crisis, an operational crisis, an environmental crisis, and it's still got to root out this maladministration, corruption within its midst. and it must be incredibly distracting. I think it is bad. It has been bad, but work is being done right now, and this needs all of our support going forward, and not a destructive approach.
What would be some examples of mismanagement at the power stations?
You know, Eskom recently gave a presentation at Letabo Power Station where they invited certain media to come along and see Letabo Power Station, which is an example of how a power station should be run. And then there are other examples which were disclosed at this media briefing of some of the very worst Eskom power stations, which are run in a completely different fashion. And one's got to ask, what is the difference? Why is one power station like Letabo performing with a very good energy availability factor, excellent housekeeping? You can see it's well run the moment you walk in. Go to the control room, go to the boilers in the basement. You can see clearly that this is a well-run operation, good housekeeping, attention to detail. And it shows in the performance, the availability of the power plant. Then you have another power plant. You can look at Kendal, Duva, Kusile Power Station, which are performing absolutely appallingly. And the difference has to be the management. From the power station manager through to the executives at the power station, through to all the different departments, something has been going wrong. The wrong people, and there's been a churn of leadership within that power station, and you can see it the moment you walk in. Smoke coming out the chimney, a sign that the electrostatic precipitators or the bag filters are not working. I mean, Kendal Power Station is notorious. They are facing criminal prosecution at the moment. Criminal prosecution by the Department of Forestry, Fisheries and Environment, is the regulatory authority, for long-standing breaches of the environmental regulations and emissions of particulates way above the legal limits. You can see it if you go into the boiler rooms, and you can see ash all over the floor. You can see pipes leaking, not being fixed. It just stares you in the face. And it's really poor management, where management has kind of lost control of their business, of their people. There's fighting among staff and management. You can't discipline anybody without, unions stepping in, and the hearings and delays, and it's a nightmare. So you just have to look at these power stations, and you can see which ones are performing. Kusile Power Station, the newest, the latest power station of Eskom, has only got 3 of its units in commercial service, despite that it's been under construction for 13 years and should have been finished in 2015. It's only half finished. And of that half finished power station, it's performing with an energy availability factor of 25%, as opposed to what a new power station should be performing with an availability of about 85 to 90%. And there are many old power stations, well, not many, but there are. Kendal is a much older power station, and is performing far better than a brand new power station, which is only half complete. So, yeah, those are some of the examples. You asked me to give you some examples, and that's a few that I can think of.
I mean, yeah, that's horrifying to hear. But I mean, a lot of our viewers would ask, how did this happen? How did Eskom land in the state it is today? Some are blaming ideology, some are blaming affirmative action. How did this happen? Why are we here where we are today?
Well, at one point in Eskom's history, not that long ago, I forget the exact year, but it was probably in the region around about the year 2000. Eskom won the international award for the best power utility in the world. At that time, it was running with significant surplus generation capacity, and it had a very high energy availability factor, and it was producing electricity that was being sold at the lowest price in the world. Not only the lowest price, but really significantly lower than the next lowest. And Eskom trumpeted this achievement. It was an achievement they were very proud of. And I think underlying this, there was a complete misunderstanding of why it was performing well and why it had the lowest cost electricity. It was not because it was the most efficient power stations or business in the world. It was not because it was the most well-run electricity utility in the world. I mean, it was running with a high availability factor because it had such a excess of generation capacity, surplus generation capacity, which meant that there was this high availability because you had all the surplus, and not only that, you had the space to do the necessary maintenance. There was a generation capacity reserve margin that was very significant, and so maintenance could be done easily and properly. There was a sort of a complacency, thinking that we are so efficient we can generate electricity at half the price of the next lowest. And of course, you've got to ask why. It was because no money was being set aside in what was previously known as a capital development fund to fund new power plants. And because they had this huge surplus generation capacity, they didn't need to build new power stations. In fact, Eskom was busy out there selling electricity in every way they could to use up the surplus, because anything that was not sold, you might say, was just a wasted opportunity. So they were out selling. They were trying to convert people who had gas boilers, who had coal-fired boilers, to what was known as electrode boilers. This is like a kettle. So and it would run on electricity, and it uses a lot of electricity. Then, of course, they were out selling cheap power. The aluminium smelters need cheap power because electricity is their biggest raw material in the production of aluminium. And so South Africa became a destination for aluminium smelters in Richards Bay, Hillside and Bayside smelters, and in Mozambique, the Mosul smelters. And Eskom offered them incredibly low prices because it had this surplus that it needed to get rid of. So anything that it could sell this electricity at was better than nothing. And it offered them these incredibly good deals. And so we lived in this fool's paradise. The other thing, of course, was the price of coal. As a strategy, Eskom had entered into long-term cost-plus contracts with coal mines that were situated at the power station itself, and these were long-term contracts, and it was done on a cost-plus basis. So the coal was not being sold at the market price; it was being sold on contract, and at incredibly low prices, actually. And it was fine while those coal mines were producing coal well and were within their lifespan. But problems start arising when they reach end of life. They need recapitalization. I won't bore you with all the details about cost plus mining, but the prices were very low, and then they started to increase to reflect the real market price. So they were living in this fool's paradise that everything was fine. And I believe complacency set in. The new management, the new CEOs that followed Ian McRae, they inherited a ship that was sailing, and they didn't know, they didn't really have a vision about what was the next punch that was going to come along and hit them. They didn't even see it coming. And in 2008, there was load shedding. Of course, there were people that did see it coming. They saw the shortages. This generation capacity reserve was being depleted. We were not building new power stations. No money had been set aside. And this set the stage for Medupi and Kusile, massive mega projects that were built, supposed to be built in a hurry to solve this crisis that had loomed, because now the generation capacity was, the excess capacity was over. It was all over now. And now they had to build these things really fast, and they'd left it too late. And they didn't have the money to do it, so it caused huge debt within Eskom. And then on top of this came this loss of management control, where procurement, irregularities and mismanagement became the order of the day. And I think it reached its hiatus under Brian Malafi and Marcella Coco. And things at that point, financially, operationally, environmentally, were completely out of control. And eventually these two CEOs, one an acting CEO and other CEO, were actually left the organization in absolute disgrace after after the public protector did a report which exposed the links to the Guptas and the financial irregularities around Optimum Colliery and the Tegeta coal mining company, and eventually Optimum Colliery, and it all collapsed. The whole thing collapsed, and these two left Eskom in disgrace. But I won't say it was only them. Far from it. There was a history in the build-up to them, but I think it reached its hiatus at that point. And thereafter came new management, Phakamani Kharebe, and then followed by Derrida, where I think the ship is being stabilized, but there are massive legacy issues that have to be dealt with. There is no quick fix. And simply changing a CEO now, at this point, in the midst of all this, is not going to change the fundamentals one little bit. To change the fundamentals, you have to work on the problem hard for many, many years. You need to do the right thing for a long time to get this thing back on track.
Well, that's a fascinating perspective. And so essentially, they didn't plan for the future way back in the early 2000s. But a lot of people are now terrified. I mean, they see load shedding every day. They are terrified at the prospect of a complete blackout. There have been rumors that this is possible. Do you think this is possible, that we can see a complete blackout?
Look, it is possible, but if you put in place the necessary plans and measures, you can reduce that possibility to a very low probability. But the very fact that there are very serious plans in place to address this matter indicates that it is a possibility, and it does happen in countries from time to time. And most recently, it happened in Zambia about a week or two ago, when there was a national blackout in Zambia. Zambia is a relatively small electricity demand in the country, and so it could be restored reasonably quickly, but the situation there, power-wise, is pretty precarious, as it is in some of our other neighbors, and as it is in South Africa, as we know from repeated load shedding for the last decade. But we do have to acknowledge that load shedding is actually a intervention, a planned intervention, to actually manage supply and demand and bring it into balance so that there is not a national blackout. If demand exceeds supply and you do nothing about it, you will eventually have a national blackout if you do nothing about that, because you're overloading the system and things will start tripping out and generators will trip out, and then you'll have less supply, and demand carries on and you don't do anything about it. Another generator will trip out because it's being overloaded. And so it cascades into a national blackout. But one thing we can say, and perhaps be thankful about, although it's not something that one should be too thankful about, but we've had a lot of practice with load shedding. We've got schedules in place, and it kind of works reasonably well. And we're pretty slick and practiced at this over the years. When they first had load shedding in 2007, 2008, there were no schedules. The municipalities didn't have plans in place about what to do and how to commands go out from national control. People start shedding load and it's rotated around the country so that it's not impacting too much on one particular group or or area. So we got quite good at this. I'm not saying it's perfect, and in fact, most recently, there has been a concerning development, and that is when national control gives out a command to do load shedding. They find that a number of municipalities who are supposed to then respond and do load shedding within their municipal areas, apparently, according to Eskom, 26 of the 28 municipalities that do their own load shedding in response to a command didn't do it properly, and so they gave out a load shed command for 2,000 megawatts to be shed, and only 1,100 megawatts was shed. About 500 megawatts not shed by municipalities, and 400 megawatts not shed by its key industrial customers. These are big industry. They didn't reduce their load as they were supposed to, according to Eskom. And that meant that, so they gave a command for 2,000 megawatts to be shed, and only 1,100 megawatts was the response. So they had to do another 2,000 load shed commands, taking it from stage 2 to stage 4, because they knew that only about half of the 2,000 megawatt command was being responded to. So if you want another 900 megawatts, let's just say roughly 1,000 megawatts, you need to issue a 2,000 megawatt command to get a 1,000 megawatt response. And Eskom found that people were not, its customers, municipalities and large industrial customers, were not responding. And this is a really serious matter, because it meant, instead of having stage 2 load shedding, the rest of the country that were responding were pushed into a stage 4 load shedding. Now that means that some people are bearing a very onerous financial burden, while others are making profits off the ones that are responding. And worse than that, it really increases the risk of a national blackout, because the whole purpose of load shedding is to avoid a national blackout, bring supply and demand into balance. And if people start getting lackadaisical and don't take it seriously and don't do what they are contractually obligated to do, it increases the probability of a national blackout. But to answer your question quickly, yes, it is possible. The probability is low. There are manual interventions that take place. And even if those fail, then there are further automatic interventions called under-frequency load shedding devices that actually will then divide the country up into a number of different islands, so that if one island has a blackout, the other islands can carry on. So that manages the situation, but it's more disruptive and less controlled. The manual rotating load shedding is quite reasonably well controlled to minimize the impact on business and industry. When under frequency load shedding steps in, as it did in Zambia, for example, it's very disruptive. But it is a necessary automated step to avoid a national blackout. So there are a whole lot of protocols in place. And there are also protocols about when you do have a national blackout, how do you restart as quickly as possible with the least possible time delay and disruption. So all of that indicates, the fact that all these plans are in place indicates that there is a possibility, but if you do it properly, it's a very slim possibility.
But to our viewers who are not energy analysts, I mean, the worst case scenario is not, we're not talking, when we're talking about a national blackout, we're not talking about like a week or two. It's probably like a day, or how long would a national blackout last?
It could last anything above 4 days, 4 or 5 days. And I just want to tell you how serious it is. If you have a national blackout, within a day or so, battery backups and diesel backups at all kinds of organizations will run out. ATMs will not operate. You will not be able to draw money. Banks will not operate. Petrol stations will not deliver petrol. Cell phones will not work. The lights will be out. We will be in darkness. The whole cell phone network will stop. There will be looting on a scale when people can't buy food, when shops close, and you can't draw money, you can't get travel, and you can't phone. You've got a serious problem on your hands. And there would be, in the darkness, widespread looting nationally on a scale that makes what we experienced previously look like a Christmas picnic. The consequences, the financial consequences and losses suffered by business will be staggering. I don't believe the insurance industry and the reinsurance industry will be adequately capitalized to even compensate businesses for the losses that they're going to suffer. They just don't have the capital reserves to fund the kind of claims that would result. It's a really serious issue, so you have to avoid it at all costs. I don't want to be alarmist, and I want to say clearly that that I think Eskom is pretty well prepared. In fact, they even practice some of the procedures of load shedding, of automated load shedding, as well as a restart from a black start. But a black start could be upwards of 5 days, depending on how well organized you are. But I do think Eskom are pretty well organized. They have a department that deals with this.
And I think if we see a blackout like that, I believe absolutely you'll see what you just described, and it could possibly enter the political union of South Africa, every province drifting in its own direction. But I mean, Ramaphosa has proposed a solution to this about, I believe, 2-3 years ago, where private companies can provide energy to Eskom. And it seems like Willem Ntasha is dragging his feet on this issue. Why do you think, or why hasn't this happened? Why is the Minister of Energy and Mineral Resources, why hasn't he made this available?
Look, things are changing. It's a result of the pressures that we can see, on Eskom, and people are experiencing power shortages, and it puts a lot of political pressure and ideology. You see, a lot of this resistance to change is ideologically driven. The idea of a centralized, state-owned public electricity utility that serves the needs of a developmental state is strongly supported by trade unions, and the socialist political ideology of the ruling party, dating back from its roots. There is this ideological basis to this. But of course, ideology only stands if there's money to support it and if it's working. And ultimately, if you don't have any money to support your ideology and it's failing and you can't spend the money fixing it because you don't have the money, then the days of this ideological position fall and is replaced by a more pragmatic, less ideological move, which is looking for solutions. Don't worry about ideology as long as it works. So ideology takes you only so far if you've got enough money to support it. I mean, a classic example of this is the Soviet Union, where I guess two guys were playing poker one night, one called Ronald Reagan, and other one called Gorbachev. And Ronald Reagan says, I'll raise you, $1,000 billion. Star Wars, we're going to put lasers in the sky and we'll knock out your satellites. That's why he puts those cards down, and Gorbachev looks at his hand and looks at the cupboard, and there's no money. And he says, I can't match. I have to fold. Boom. That's it. Game over. And the Berlin Wall came down. The empire was over. This massive, monolithic Soviet empire that everybody thought was impregnable suddenly crumbled like a pack of cards. And the empire was over, and chaos reigned in Russia for many years thereafter. But the whole ideological basis of the Soviet Union ended because there was no more money in the kitty to support it. And ultimately, in South Africa, we are starting to become more pragmatic and drop these ideological positions. Of course, certain people with vested interests are screaming blue bloody murder because they've been profiting handsomely by treating Eskom as their piggy bank. And there's a whole ecosystem feeding off the mismanagement and the corruption within the state-owned entity. So when the doors get closed and people start looking at other solutions, and the old model is not working anymore, and the doors have been closed, they will fight back to keep the status quo, because that is where they see their interests. I just feel that there is progress taking place driven by reality. The reality is that Eskom is not working, and it presents a massive risk to South Africa. A risk because all our eggs are in the Eskom basket. Something like 90%, 95% all the electricity in South Africa is generated by Eskom. And there's another risk that the country faces, that 80% of all the electricity that Eskom produces comes from coal. And that presents a huge strategic risk to South Africa in a world that is moving away from coal and is going to punish us for our high carbon footprint of our products, which are manufactured with a high carbon footprint. And the world is looking at products and saying, no, we're not going to buy products that have a high carbon footprint that are produced by coal-fired electricity. We want products that are produced with a low carbon footprint. And so barriers get put up, trade barriers, cross-border adjustment tariffs, which will penalize products from South Africa, like South African steel. It's a classic example. We will never export South African steel if it's produced from 80% from coal. And of course, even the steel making process itself, the heating of iron ore, is done by coal. So South African steel has a high carbon footprint and will be punished through trade barriers going forward. So the risks to South Africa are these over dependencies on a monopoly company that is failing, and on coal, as 80% of our electricity comes from coal. And the answer to manage these risks is to diversify. Diversify Eskom. I'm not saying Eskom is going to disappear. It's always going to be a huge player. But we need other players that can also generate power into the grid and thereby relieve Eskom of its burden that it cannot meet at the moment. So the more other smaller generators are also generating into the grid, the less Eskom is being overloaded. Eskom cannot meet demand. So take away some demand from it. Supply that from independent power producers. Eskom will always be there as a big player, but not the only player. And that diversifies risk. And then, of course, we need to move away from this overdependence on coal, diversify our energy sources into wind and solar PV, battery storage, hydropower, pump water storage, and all the different energy options, gas to power. You'll notice I haven't said one thing I haven't said is nuclear. We can get to that. But we need to diversify our energy mix to the least cost options, to those that create the most jobs, to those that use the least water, and to those that come in at the least cost. That's what we have to diversify. We mustn't diversify into things that don't create jobs, that use a lot of water, that create a lot of pollution, and that are not fit for purpose or cost too much or take too long to deliver.
So on that note, Chris, do you believe that the Minister of Finance, Godongwana's new proposal to sell some of the coal power plants is a sign of that pragmatism coming into play?
Yeah, look, there's mixed feelings about this. It may have been something that could have worked a decade ago, but some people are really beginning to ask the question, are these old coal-fired power stations assets or are they liabilities? People like to buy assets that can produce money. They don't like to buy liabilities that become a millstone around your neck. And you have to look forward and not backwards. So whilst they may be producing electricity now and they kind of paid up, do you want to own a coal-fired power station going forward or not? So there's that aspect to it. But on the other hand, let me say that if you can guarantee a revenue stream, if Eskom says, I'll sell you this power station and I will guarantee to buy your power from you at a certain price per kilowatt hour going forward for the next 20 years, that revenue stream every year creates an asset value. Because an asset has value if it can deliver a predictable revenue stream for the next 20 years. You can work backwards to find out what is the value of that asset. That is what you would pay. So there was a very interesting paper about two or 3 years ago by a gentleman at the time called Tobias Bischoff-Nims, Dr. Tobias Bischoff-Nims. He used to be the head of the energy section of the CSIR, together with another guy called Johan van den Berg. They wrote a paper that Eskom should auction its power stations progressively, not all at once, selectively, one at a time, go out on a public bidding process, auction process, but coupled to selling the power station would be the undertaking that Eskom would guarantee to buy the power from the power station at a certain price for the next 20 years. And let's see who offers the highest price based on that revenue stream, guaranteed. That was the sort of thing, and it resonated. And it was even mentioned by our former Minister of Finance, Tito Mboweni, in a document he produced about looking at the future of Eskom. And it was quite interesting to note Godongwana picking this up again. But I fear that the bus may have moved on. I don't know. There are people now, financial institutions don't want to fund coal. They don't want to. This is a liability for them, a big liability, because the world is moving away from coal and punishing people whose products are manufactured using coal-fired electricity. So do people want to buy it? Well, the only thing you could do is test the market. Go out on an auction. Tell people. The beauty of it for Eskom means that they have a known price of electricity for the next 20 years. You can say, we'll buy your electricity at 90 cents a kilowatt hour, linked to or indexed to the consumer price index for the next 20 years. So the price is going to go up each year by the inflation rate, but in real terms, it's fixed. In nominal terms, it is rising by the consumer price index, but in real terms, it's a fixed price for 20 years. It's very attractive for an organization like Eskom, which which is suffering huge cost increases in labor and staff overstaffing, can't get rid of overstaffing because of unions and government support. But of course, all very well, but labor will scream blue bloody murder at what they would see as a privatization. So there would be a lot of contestation and conflict. So it's easy to float this idea and fly a kite and see which way the wind is blowing, but it's going to be harder to do. It's easier said than done, in my opinion. But I'm not writing it off. I'm ultimately, only way you'll find out is by testing the market, is by starting a bidding process and see what offers come in.
That's a fascinating perspective, and I can imagine why certain investors would be hesitant to invest in a sinking ship, what they would consider a sinking ship. But earlier you mentioned about Eskom providing energy to the rest of Africa. A lot of viewers and South Africans are wondering, are we doing this at the expense of South Africans? Is this the reason why? Can this contribute to load shedding? Shouldn't we start providing energy to the rest of Africa and just focus on South Africa?
The answer is South Africa is not exporting significant quantities of electricity to Africa. Not at all. In fact, South Africa is importing more electricity from our neighbors than we are exporting to our neighbors. We're not supplying electricity to the whole of Africa, far, far from it. But we are selling electricity, or shall I call it trading electricity. There is a trading platform called the South African Power Pool, which trades electricity at times of surplus. When there is surplus electricity in one country, they trade it through a market called the day-ahead market of the South African Power Pool, with other countries that are connected to the common grid that may be having a shortage. And it's done by a bidding process. If you've got excess generation capacity that you've got for the next day, you say, does anybody want to buy this? I'm selling it at so many rands a kilowatt hour for the day ahead. And if a country says, oh, I've got a bit of a shortage, or my generation comes in at a higher price than what's being offered, I'd rather buy it from on the market and save a bit of money. Instead of running my own generation, I'll buy the surplus generation at a cheaper price. So some trading takes place by countries such as South Africa, Namibia, Botswana, Zimbabwe, Zambia, Angola, I think, is part of the power pool. I'm not 100% sure. So there's a group of Southern African countries which are interconnected on this common grid. And in theory, I mean, this is what happens in Europe. You have a European grid and people trade electricity when there's surpluses, and it's a very important balancing mechanism between supply and demand that works to the benefit of all the members of the pool, the power pool. It enables them to sell surplus electricity that they otherwise wouldn't be able to sell. And they're also able to buy electricity cheap at the marginal price of generating electricity when another country's got a surplus, and they could buy it and avoid running some of their expensive generation capacity. So it's a very important balancing mechanism. In South Africa, there's a little bit of a problem in the sense that South Africa is so big compared to our neighbors that the amount of trading that takes place is actually so small compared to the whole South Africa's demand and South Africa's usage of electricity, per day in gigawatt hours or megawatt hours. The amount that is traded is minuscule, actually. And that means it can never operate like an effective market like in Europe, where you've got a lot of different countries, all interconnected, all able to have surplus and trade. And in South Africa, we've got this big elephant and a lot of small little mice around us. So it doesn't really work as it should, as well as it should. But trading, I think, is a very important thing. That's the one thing. Second thing, just to say, there are what is known as bilateral contracts. That is now not, it's not trading. That is a contract, a supply contract between two countries. So South Africa may have a supply contract with Zimbabwe. You have to pay in advance, okay, up front, not in arrears. Okay, Eskom did get into arrears, and Zimbabwe did owe some, but I think Eskom has now learned no credit. You pay up front deposits. You always operate in credit, especially with countries that are, not financially strong. Bottom line is that the bilateral contracts are really quite small, really. And in fact, the bilateral contract between Eskom and Mozambique, that is the Cahora Bassa scheme, is the biggest by far. And that is a contract to supply electricity to South Africa, not exporting South African power, but buying it. So it's completely overplayed. People don't understand it. They say, oh, we're supplying electricity to our neighbors when we're having load shedding. Actually, on bilateral contracts, if South Africa is having load shedding, we load shed the country who has a bilateral contract. So if South Africa has to reduce power by 10%, Zimbabwe has to reduce its power offtake from South Africa by 10%. So we're all in the same boat. The last thing I want to say is that the well-being of our neighbors is intimately tied up with our own well-being. If we have a neighbor like Zimbabwe that has got no electricity at all, it is a threat to South Africa in many ways, the least of all being immigration and a flood of people that are overloading and causing tensions within the South African economy, in the social and political structures, xenophobia. There are a lot of seriously negative consequences, and it is good that all our neighbors around us should be doing as well, at least as we are. That generates stability in the region. So there are political, economic reasons why trading of electricity and bilateral contracts are, in my opinion, a good thing and not a bad thing. And they certainly are not worsening our load shedding. That I can tell you for sure.
But that makes absolute sense. And did we experience load shedding recently because we were buying electricity from Zambia and the electrical generators failed there? Is that why we experienced load shedding?
No, not at all. Not at all. We experienced load shedding at a higher level than normal for a shortish period of time, not because Zambia was supplying us with electricity, but because there was a disturbance on the network caused by a sudden loss of generation capacity in Zambia. That causes a disturbance on the system, and now other generators connected on the South African power pool have to start delivering power to Zambia, okay, because they've lost all their generation capacity suddenly. And in a certain space of time, certain protective devices step in and disconnect Zambia from the South African power pool because of this condition. And these are what I call automatic islanding. You remember what I talked about under frequency load shedding. So the moment you lose all the power, generation capacity at Kariba power station in Zambia, suddenly the frequency of the grid reduces from 50 hertz to 49.5, and at certain points under frequency protection relays trip out and island Zambia from the rest of the network. Now suddenly the frequency rises again and there's a disturbance. There are power flows that are caused by this disturbance, and various devices trip out, and it causes a temporary disturbance on the grid and on the network, a temporary instability. And within 2 hours, by the way, that caused the Cahora Bassa line to trip out. That means a loss of power of 1,000 megawatts to South Africa. So that wasn't Zambia. The Zambia thing initiated a system disturbance. It caused a trip out of the Kahora-Bassa line. The line was restored within 2 hours and things got back to normal. Okay, but for a period of time, there was a disturbance on the system that had to be addressed, and some of the emergency generators in South Africa started up, the open cycle gas turbines and the pumped water storage scheme. So in fact, it didn't really result in load shedding, but it did result in some additional costs to South Africa to run these more expensive generation forms, as well as to use up some of our emergency reserve that we would otherwise use to, to avert load shedding. But to suggest that, supply of electricity to Zambia by South Africa caused, load shedding is not correct. And the problems, that Zambia experienced were not due to South Africa. It was due to a loss of generation capacity on the Zambian grid at Victoria Falls Power Station.
So, Chris, earlier you mentioned nuclear energy. Why don't we have more nuclear plants? It seems like this is the future, and it's a very climate-friendly way to go. Why don't we have more nuclear energy power plants?
So at the moment, we have one power plant with 2 reactors, a total of 1,800 megawatts out of a total of about 40,000 megawatts. So about 5% of our electricity comes from, a little less than 5%, but let's just round it off at 5% comes from nuclear power. The plant has been generating for about 30 years or so. It is reaching the end of life. In fact, its license comes to an end in 2024, and Eskom has to embark on a life extension program, including the replacement of the steam generators and other work that has to be done to bring up the safety standards to the right level, to the most modern level, and to get a new license to continue operating for another 20 years. So that's where we are at the moment. So your question is, why don't we have some more of this? Isn't it wonderful? Eskom, tell us, this is the cheapest generation plant in the fleet, generates electricity at 40 cents a kilowatt hour, which is much lower than the others. Look, there's a lot of smoke and mirrors in all of this, and I can explain a little bit. First of all, we can talk about things like the safety issues, and some people believe that this is a massive issue, that nuclear power is not safe. My view is that's overplayed, and the nuclear safety record actually is quite good. Of course, there is a risk of an accident. The consequences. Yeah, there is a very low probability of a major problem, but the consequences of it are so high that no commercial insurance company can insure the consequences of a nuclear accident. It is beyond their financial capabilities to insure it, and you cannot reinsure it. In other words, sometimes when things get that big, you have to go to the reinsurance market that insures insurance companies for losses. Okay, so it's just too big for all of that. So you've got to understand what risk is. Risk is a combination of the probability of an event and the consequences of an event. So even though the probability might be very low, if the consequences are high enough, it presents such a big risk that an insurance company says, sorry, I'm not going to insure. And that's where we are with nuclear. No insurance company will insure you for the consequences of a nuclear accident. It's just too much. So there is a risk. The probability is low, but there is a real risk that no insurance company will insure for a start. So that's the safety issue. The other thing, of course, is the pollution issue. South Africa has no long-term waste disposal site. So all the nuclear waste, the high-level nuclear waste fuel, spent fuel, is stored on site at Kuburg. Everything that has ever been, all the spent fuel is sitting there at Kuburg, and there is no place to put it. So it'll sit there for, well, who knows how long, till they find a place to put it. It's really expensive to put it where It needs to be deep underground in a geologically stable condition. We haven't got that facility in South Africa, and frankly, they haven't even got it in America. And they've got, like 100 reactors in America, or more than 100 reactors. They got no place to put the stuff. It's hot stuff. Okay, but assume that that's not the problem. Assume that engineers will sort out this problem with the waste. Assume that safety can be managed. You just put in enough safety features. It costs a lot, but you can operate them safely. And they've been operating, for decades and decades. Koeberg, not a single life has been lost at Koeberg as a result of nuclear radiation, not one. And in the same time, 15,000 people die on the roads in South Africa every single year. But we still drive cars. Okay? It doesn't stop us from driving cars. Not one person has died of nuclear radiation in Koeberg. Okay, just to put it in perspective. So I don't think it's a safety issue. And I think maybe engineers can manage the nuclear waste thing. Maybe, I don't know. Okay, but what are the real problems? For me, I put aside all those things. First of all, the capital cost is very high. It's the highest of all the generation capacity. Number two, you'll be lucky if you can deliver it in 15 years. You'll be lucky. There are plants in America and other countries that they've started building and they've abandoned it halfway through because costs got out of control. Time and cost overruns were such that they eventually decided, let's call it a day. It's cost too much. You can just work out that the return on investment, there's better things to spend money on. Okay. Second, the next thing is, it takes so long to build. The next thing is, it's a very inflexible generation source. First of all, inflexible in the procurement. You have to buy a fleet from one vendor country, let's say Russia or China, from one vendor company, let's just say Rosatom, using one nuclear technology, like a pressurized water reactor. You have to buy a fleet of them that are going to commit you to this one country, this one vendor, this one technology for the next 100 years. You are locked in at a time when the energy sector is undergoing rapid change, like what happened in the cell phone industry. Would you buy a cell phone that lasted you 100 years? Of course not. If you bought a Nokia brick all those years ago, that wasn't a smartphone, didn't have you'd be locked in to this technology and you wouldn't be able to take advantage of the massive improvements that are happening. Same is happening in energy. Prices of renewable energy is coming crashing down. The whole system is changing from a centrally generated system, which is what nuclear is all about. Big, lumpy plants, in a central operation. Now we're moving to a distributed generation where there are smaller plants operating flexibly. You can build them quickly. They can deliver. Their life is not so long. You're not committed forever. The tech is much lower tech. It's not complicated stuff. And financiers are uncomfortable funding a project that may become a stranded asset. You may have bought a cell phone, and at a certain point, you're paying this bloody thing off, but you decide, throw it away. Now, the funders are at risk. The funders, the people who put up the money, because all of a sudden there's no revenue stream coming from this power station to fund the debt. And who's carrying the risk? The lenders. Okay, so financial institutions don't like projects that run much beyond 20 years at the most. Okay, so last thing to say is, when you build a power station that's only going to deliver electricity in 15 years' time, you need to look ahead with your crystal ball and say, what will the electricity look like, the electricity system look like in 15 years where this system is going to compete with? In 15 years, we are going to have to build about 40,000 megawatts. 40,000 megawatts of renewable energy in terms of our current plans to replace, 22,000 megawatts of coal-fired power that's going to be retired, and to cater for the growth in the economy and to build a sufficient reserve margin. We're going to have to build that, because that is what can be delivered during the next 15 years, and what has to be delivered. Now comes along 2035, when this nuclear reactor comes along, and they're talking about buying it. The procurement is for 2,500 megawatts of nuclear power. Now you've got 2,500 megawatts of steady power, and you've got 30,000 megawatts of variable power. Okay. What you do not need is steady power. That's actually what you don't want. What you do want is flexible generation that can fill the gaps in the variable power, that can ramp up and ramp down quickly in order to complement the variability of renewable energy. You do not want baseload. Baseload is a liability in a system dominated by variable power. What you want is flexible generation. Flexible generation is provided by hydropower, pumped storage, gas to power, battery storage. That can deliver power quickly to respond. When the sun goes behind a cloud, you ramp up the output of a flexible generator. When the sun comes out of the cloud, you ramp it down. At night time, when the wind is blowing and it stops blowing, you need to fill the gaps. So nuclear power is, when you look forward to 15 years' time, what we need is flexible power that can be ramped up and fill the gaps. What we don't need is 2,500 megawatts of power that runs flat out. It doesn't help you. You might as well not even have it. It's insignificant. So, and just remember, demand for electricity is variable. It's not steady. It's not steady. We need flexible power. That's the future. The old idea of what is called baseloadism, the old paradigm of baseloadism and mid-merit peaking plant to meet demand is over. It's over because renewable energy is so cheap. You need to buy as much as you can get your hands on, and then you need to pay a little bit extra to sort out the variability by putting in flexible generation. And the combination of wind and solar PV and flexible generation is cheaper than nuclear power or coal. It's as simple as that. And it creates more jobs, uses less CO2, uses less water, and is cheaper. So it ticks all the boxes. Nuclear power doesn't tick the boxes. It ticks some of the boxes, but not all of them.
That's fascinating, and a powerful argument to be made not to provide nuclear energy in South Africa for the moment, at least. But Chris, a lot of people, they obviously experience load shedding on a daily basis. What advice would you give them to handle load shedding? What are some private methods that you can employ to not to nullify the effects of most of the load shedding?
Well, of course, every customer is different. They've got to look at their own business case, etc. But let me just look at my own case. I run a small business from home. In the past, load shedding has been an inconvenience for me. It affects my life. The lights go out. I have to run some battery operated lights. I have to cook on gas. My pool pump motor doesn't run. It's an inconvenience, but that's all. But now I run a business from home. It's not an inconvenience anymore. When I don't have power, I'm losing money. Significant, because I can't work. My computer, my router, my fiber box, my printer, lights, whatever I use in my office, doesn't work. For 2 hours at a time, sometimes twice a day. So I've got a very simple system. I bought an Ellie's inverter and battery pack, 720 watts. It runs my router, my laptop, my fiber box, and a couple of lights in my study. And it can power those for 2 days without power, because these are items that don't draw a lot of power. My lights, I've got battery operated lights. So, man, carry them around, it's fine. My TV, well, I can live without TV, to be honest, and radio. But I can't live without my computer and my internet connection. I've got a gas stove and a gas oven. My fridge, well, it can stay cold for 2 hours. After 2 hours, it's still cold. Okay, if I lost power for a day, it would be different. So with an investment of about 7,000 Rand, 6,500 Rand, I've solved my problem. Load shedding in my business is not a problem. And that came pretty cheap. It was the best investment I ever made. But not everybody is a one-man business that operates from home. Some people have factories, some people. So you've got to look at the different business case about how are you going to become more resilient, because load shedding is going to become a fact of life, at least for the next few years, maybe longer. If you look at countries like Nigeria, it's part of life. For as long as you shall live, they've had problems for years. And Zimbabwe is the same. I'm not saying we're going to go that route, and I hope we don't. But every company's got to look at what it needs. It may need some solar PV, battery storage. Big companies, are not talking about going off the grid, but if a lot of big companies all install solar PV systems, what we call grid-tied solar PV systems, it will reduce, they will be able to supplement their energy needs during the daylight hours when most businesses operate. And most, I'm not talking about the 24-hour process industries, but even the process industries like Sasol are talking about very significant solar PV installations. Sasol has gone out for tender with Air Liquide for 900 megawatts. 900, this is massive. It's the biggest renewable energy installation for one plant that this country has ever seen. The point of the matter is they can deliver energy to their system cheaper than what they're buying it from Eskom. So it can reduce their electricity bill, displace some of the electricity that they would otherwise buy from Eskom. And when all these mines and companies do this, it relieves Eskom of its burden and will make a significant difference to reducing load shedding to everybody, including themselves. By simply, if South Africa could generate, let's say, 5 or 6 or 7,000 megawatts of PV distributed all around different companies, it will really make a difference to Eskom's load shedding. It will actually avoid Eskom load shedding completely, certainly during the daylight hours. And that's going to really help the economy. It's going to help Eskom. It's going to help business. It's going to help us, the person in the street, because they won't be experiencing these load shedding. So really, there's a lot that people can do. And what I generally say is that people need to start taking ownership of their own energy future. They've got to look at their own situation. And they've got to say, how can I act in my own interests to make myself more resilient and less dependent and less disrupted? And we need to become part of the solution. We need to take control of our own energy futures. If we wait for government, we could be waiting a hell of a long time. So I think that's the kind of message that I give out to everybody, whether you're small, whether you're domestic, whether you're small business, medium business, large business, mine, Sasol. Every one of us should be looking at, how do I make myself more resilient?
And I live in Cape Town, so I hope my problem will be solved by the Democratic Alliance. But Chris, thank you so much for your time. This has been such a fascinating conversation on a topic that's obviously so prevalent to us on a daily basis. I want to give you one last opportunity to add or plug, say anything that you want to.
To be honest, I think we've covered just about everything. But maybe I want to I have kind of made this point before, but I want to make it again strongly. Right now, there's a lot of anger out there. People are full. Load shedding is disrupting their life and their business. It's inconvenient. It's a pain in the neck. And there's a lot of anger out there. And of course, that anger is directed at the politicians sometimes, and through an election, and it has results in an election, and that's when politicians start to feel it. That's when they feel it, when it's starting to affect their power. Power now in a different sense than just electric power. And people are angry and putting pressure on politicians. So there is a very sort of feeling that, who do we blame? Yeah, who is the face of Eskom? Who are we going to make the scapegoat for all these problems? Politicians will never point at themselves. For the last 20 years, they've done pretty much nothing. But they will point fingers and find a scapegoat that is not themselves. Very easy to find scapegoats when you've got political power, and of course the face of Eskom is the CEO. And so he's a natural person you are to blame. But of course he's not to blame, actually, in the sense that these problems, took 15 years to develop. Long before he was anywhere near Eskom, Medupi and Kusile, the seeds of the destruction of the South African electricity industry were being sown through Medupi and Kusile. The load shedding we experience today is a result of Medupi and Kusile firstly not coming on stream when they should have been on stream in 2015, delivering power with a 90% load factor, energy availability factor. That's what should have happened. That was like years before the Rata ever appeared on the scene. That's where the Eskom debt comes from. That's where that's where load shedding comes from. Many other problems, the whole state capture thing, the corruption and mismanagement and the loss of control of Eskom took place before he arrived. There are layers of mismanagement and corruption that have to be sorted out. New generation capacity doesn't come from Eskom. Eskom, the law has been changed. It makes it the responsibility of the Department of Mineral Resources and Energy. They have got to procure new power, not Eskom. Eskom completely, they are powerless to do anything about it. And so the old generation capacity problems were not the Rata's problems, and the new ones he can do nothing about as well. So to blame the person who's sitting there, he's only been there about just under 2 years, trying to deal with all these issues, and now you want to deliver his head on a plate to the politicians who are to blame. Is not going to solve, it'll solve nothing. It doesn't change, by changing the CEO, doesn't change the problems. The new CEO will face the same problem. It'll take 6 months to put in place a new CEO, because there's a whole process that government goes through to find and advertise and interview and shortlist and blah, 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 and all the politics that goes with it. Finally, you get a new CEO. In the midst of a crisis, what we don't need is a utility without a helm. And we've seen the problems of changing CEOs every year in Eskom. That is what we don't need right now. We need stability. We need people with vision. We need determination. We need to roll up our sleeves and do what has to be done, and not get sidetracked by populist demands, for a scapegoat. That's not the solution in any way. That's perhaps where I'd like to end.
Absolutely. A very wise analysis. Chris, thank you so much for your time. To our viewers, if you've made it this far, please consider, you obviously enjoy the content, so please consider liking this video, sharing it as widely as possible, and subscribing to our channel. My name is Donald, and you've been watching WorldView.